mourning and public memory. My name is Kasim Husain, and I'm a PhD candidate at McMaster University, working with Dr. Chakraborty. So I'd like to introduce the panelists prior to their presentations, so we can get things underway really quickly. So our first panelist today is Farah Moosa. Farah is a PhD candidate in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. Her dissertation examines second and subsequent generation responses to private and public trauma in the work of Canadian authors such as Fred Waugh, Joy Kogawa, Hiromi Goto, Renée Sarojini, and David Cheriandy. So take us away.
Hi, everyone. I feel very privileged to be presenting a paper at this very special conference. So my paper today is titled Another Version of This Moment Exists, Renée Sarojini Saklikar's Children of Air India and the Air India Saga. So my paper today is part of a longer piece that examines how Renée Saklikar's poetry collection, Children of Air India, engages with the Air India archive and dominant versions of the Air India story in order to challenge the idea of a singular story. I argue that Saklikar works against the singular story by presenting personal narratives that exist within, against, and alongside official versions. In doing so, I suggest, she also memorializes the lives lost. In the first part of my paper, I look at Saklikar's discussion of one of the central experiences of those connected to the Air India story, the tension between memory and forgetting. In the second part, I discuss selected poems that help illustrate my argument. So, part one. In the afterword to her 2013 poetry collection, Children of Air India, Renée Sarojini writes, "A central experience of being held within the saga that is Air India is one of forgetting, remembering. The events leading up to the bombing, the act itself, and its aftermath are well documented, are obscured within the mainstream of Canadian culture. As the niece of family members who died in the bombing, this impulse, remember, forget, propels memorial and its counterforms, seeing in those things and processes in dense layered story, time, and its materials. Saklikar's afterword, which is suggestively titled for an afterword that might be read as a preface, makes several significant claims. First, she argues that forgetting, remembering, is a central experience for individuals who are intimately connected to and affected by the Air India bombing. More specifically, Saklikar signals how forgetting and remembering are closely tied and in tension with one another by connecting and at the same time separating the two verbs with a forward slash. So that's right here, where she signals that the two are closely tied by actually tying them together. Her use of the phrase held within to describe the experience of forgetting and remembering also gestures towards the disjuncture or disconnection that some Air India family members may feel between their personal narratives and the official discourse surrounding the event, drawing attention to the need for more unofficial narratives of the Air India story. Even when available, such narratives have often become dominated by official versions of the story, contributing to the experience of forgetting/remembering. Cultural memory, then, becomes a pressing concern. Secondly, in her afterword, Saklikar indicates that the experience of forgetting and remembering is what propels or drives and pushes her forward in her creative work and practice. This assertion draws my attention to the work that Children of Air India performs as a creative remembrance. As critics Miqbal, Jonathan Crew, and Leo Spitzer point out, cultural memory is performative. In other words, we don't necessarily just bear memory, we perform memory. As those of you who are familiar with Saklikar's work already know, Children of Air India weaves official documents from the Air India archive into its poems, exploring and reimagining the stories of the 82 children under the age of 13 who were killed in the bombing. And Saklikar does this within the context of her loss of her aunt and her uncle, and the adult lives lost on the same flight. To enter this difficult and traumatic space, Saklikar adopts a poet persona, N, through whom she finds the necessary critical distance to share her story. N stands for both narrator and niece. By addressing the issue of forgetting/remembering Air India in her afterword, and suggesting that the piece might also serve as a preface, Saklikar resists the closure of her narrative and the forgetting of the Air India story, inviting readers to continue thinking about her claims, which also manifest themselves throughout the pages of Children of Air India, by rereading or reflecting upon her collection. So she asks us to think about, what does it mean to inherit, to be held in the Air India Saga? What are the possibilities and obligations of artistically representing aspects of this saga, given the issue of forgetting and remembering? And how should the reader, who bears witness to N's testimony and the stories of the children of Air India, remember Air India anew? The questions raised by Saklikar's text, together with the poet's refusal to close her narrative, indicate to readers that we cannot and should not ever be finished with Air India. As I noted earlier, what I find compelling is how Saklikar engages with the Air India archive and dominant versions of the Air India story in order to challenge conceptions of a singular story. She does this by, as I noted, presenting personal narratives. Indeed, another version of this moment exists, is a refrain that is repeated in Children of Air India, signaling the collisions between official and unofficial narratives, and drawing our attention to a multiplicity of perspectives. In her afterword, Saklikar states that there develops an ecosphere, a habitat that surrounds any public/private tragedy, an environment containing the remains of violent acts, cultural artifacts, personal stories, investigation, as well as exhaustion and longing. And in the case of Air India, there is, she says, underneath everlastingly the loss of 329 people, plus 2 more. I believe that Saklikar's Children of Air India makes an important contribution to this ecosphere through its documentation of N's experiences alongside her reimagining of the lives and deaths of the children who were killed in the bombing. By interacting with the Air India archive and providing personal narratives as evidence in a case against forgetting, Saklikar memorializes the lives lost and reinscribes the lessons of the Air India story into Canadian cultural memory. So here I'd like to turn to the opening frames of Children of Air India and talk a bit about how Saklikar frames her poetry collection. So from the very beginning, Saklikar asserts the significance of the Air India victims by paying tribute to them in her dedication to Children of Air India. The dedication reads, "For the Beloved," a dedication that is inclusive and open-ended. It includes Saklikar's aunt and uncle as 2 of the beloved. Beloved, too, are the children who were killed in the bombing, for as Saklikar states, the collection is in part a lament for children dead and dead again in representations released. And that's a quote from Saklikar. Saklikar's dedication works against the belief that some lives are less grievable than others. Furthermore, the category of the beloved extends to any individuals who have lost their lives through acts of mass violence. For Saklikar does not specifically state that her work is dedicated to her aunt and uncle, the children, or the other adults who were murdered on Flight 182. The openness is noteworthy, for it allows Saklikar to strategically place Air India in the context of other public and private traumas from the beginning of her narrative. Saklikar also imaginatively reopens the Air India trial post-inquiry, as N presents the bombing itself as an exhibit in the first poem, which is titled "In Which N Imposes Meaning." in the opening lines of that poem and states, Exhibit, June 23, 1985, detonation. In the airplane, a hole blows open, left aft fuselage, the drop 31,000 feet into the Atlantic. N's description of the blast echoes official statements that were made confirming the presence of a bomb on Air India Flight 182. By representing the bombing as an exhibit, N reopens questions surrounding Air India from an unofficial perspective, positioning her readers as judges, the jury, and or members of the general public in a trial, and ultimately asks them to act witness to the stories of the children of Air India. In Touch of the Past, Roger Simon suggests that the practice of a transactive public memory evokes a persistent sense, not of belonging, but of being in relation to, of being claimed in relation to the experiences of others. And I think that's something that Saklikar is asking us to do. So here I'd like to move on to the second part of my presentation, where I'd like to do a close reading of one of her exhibit poems. So the exhibit poems about the children of Air India act as evidence in the case against forgetting and memorialize the children themselves. So the poems' titles, and there's a number of these poems in the collection, the poems' titles give a sobering picture of the bombing by referring to the victims by age and repeating the date on which they died, twinning these facts together in the reader's consciousness. For example, in Part 1, 5 exhibit poems which tell stories about the personalities, interests, or everyday lives of the children who died, many of whom were siblings, are titled as follows. Exhibit 1985, 9, 4, 10 months. Exhibit 1985, 14, 2 months. Exhibit 1985, 14, 11. Exhibit 1985, 12, and Exhibit Age Unknown. And the poem I'd like to focus on today is Exhibit 1985, 1411. So Exhibit 1985, 1411 memorializes 2 brothers, one of whom we learn excels in French, English, math, and science, and the other of whom has a paper route. Focusing mostly on the paper route boy, Saklikar narrates the story of how, one day, when the boy was on his route, an old woman asks him to buy a carton of milk for her and offers $2. When he gets home from his route, the boy's father scolds him for taking money from an old lady and tells his son to return the money to her. And the boy, of course, is quite upset because he doesn't feel he did anything wrong in accepting a tip, and tells his father that he did actually work for the money because he ran all the way to get the milk and give it back to her. So the boy slow walks back to the woman's house. Transitioning to the tale of another one of the boy's slow walks, Saklikar explains how, when the family is ready to leave for the airport, the boy lags behind in his home. Though everyone is waiting for him, he takes the time to touch each piece of furniture, saying goodbye sofa, goodbye lamp. Reading the boy's goodbyes as a sign of foreboding, Saklikar juxtaposes the family stories about the paper route boy's activities before the flight, with an official statement issued after his death. Borrowing the language of a coroner's report, she writes, status, it is his brother's body found. Saklikar's juxtaposition of official and unofficial narratives allows her to reinsert Air India family subjects like the boy and his family into Canadian public memory in a way that challenges any notions of closure. Exhibit 1985, 1411 seems to take its inspiration from the lives of 2 South Asian Canadian brothers who died on Flight 182. The boy's mother, an outspoken critic of the Canadian government's failures in relation to Air India and an advocate for the Air India families, has become one of the more publicly known Air India family members. In her testimony at the Air India inquiry, the mother noted that her son was very good at French, English, math, and science. She also noted how her younger son managed to get himself a paper route at age 10 though the minimum age required for the job was 12. Saklikar's narrative about the paper route boy seems to be inspired by the younger boy's life. His mother shares strikingly similar stories in her testimony. Like the testimonies of other family members, the mother's statement appears in its entirety in court documents and is summarized in Justice John Major's first report on the Commission of Inquiry, which is entitled The Families Remember, and includes personal stories from the victims' families. And here I'm going to ask Daniel to pass the book around. Thank you. So unlike the official documents, which have limited circulation in the public realm, and in which stories of the victims' families have possibly been incorporated into a larger narrative, Saklikar's poems allows stories about the children like these boys to continue to circulate in the public realm. Saklikar also insists upon the Canadianness of many of the children in her poems as a way to resist the state position that the event was not a Canadian tragedy. For instance, a poem called Exhibit, where visitations occur, for instance, tells the story of a young Canadian boy who loved to play soccer and hockey. Saklikar's poems that are dedicated to the children also demonstrate a variety of interests and characteristics, undoing the idea that the children's deaths are to be mourned because they were model children or future model minority citizens. For example, Exhibit number 4 revolves around a well-liked Etobicoke teenager, suburban with duty, who knows that her parents want her to, quote, be good, be the best, do more, marry well. Together, poems such as Exhibit 1985-1411 and Exhibit number 4, all of which end with official reports noting the status of the children's bodies, intervene in the Air India archive by acting as sites of memory, providing personal narratives about children who may not be well known and well remembered in Canadian public memory. The absence of the children's names which were redacted, underscores the ghostly or absent presence of the children. Haunting both N and the collection as a whole through their constant presence, the unnamed children demand to be remembered. As they tell readers from underwater in one of her poems, called June 23rd Evening, add everything we did not become. Forget, remember. Water is nothing but itself. Where are our names? They are redacted. Thank you.
He works eclectically across literary, cultural, and religious studies, focusing on queer sexuality, intellectual history after Kant, and South Asian diaspora. His articles have appeared or are forthcoming in Australian Humanities Review, Religion and Arts, Culture and Religion, an interdisciplinary journal, and Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies. Soni's current book project is titled Dissident Secularism, Queer Exegesis as Disciplinary Critique from Kant to Modernist Literature.
I'm not going to get Kantian today. Thank God. So this paper is titled Grieving States, Mourning Time, Sikh Memory and Post-National Justice. Can you all hear me at the back? I'd like to begin at a certain end, or more precisely, beyond a certain narrative end, namely with the postscript in Anita Badami's novel, Can You Hear the Nightbird Call? I won't engage this novel as an object of literary criticism. Apart from suggesting how ideological production operates in fiction that represents transnational violence, I'm more interested in deploying the novel as a springboard for conceptual work in Sikh studies, and I'll say why. I've recently been asked to edit a theory colloquium special issue of the journal Sikh Formations on the issue of impunity and state violence. So what I'm going to read today is drawn to some extent from that endeavor. The postscript in question juxtaposes two excerpts from newspaper articles published within 5 months of each other in 2005. I prefer to read these excerpts symbolically as politicized epitaphs or melancholic grievances for a failed global vision of democratic states as accountable to citizens victimized in different ways by anti-state and state violence. Notwithstanding the tensions that this reading conjures for the novel itself, I would like these passages to evoke, however unwittingly, one of Edward Said's signature arguments, namely his strong case, made at least in 2 volumes, for a post-nationalist culture of the state as a state, and that's quoting Said directly. Before touching on that concept, though, permit me to read aloud the novel's postscript. I quote, Vancouver. In a stunning conclusion to a case that spanned 20 years, 2 Canadians were found not guilty on first-degree murder charges in the bombing of Air India Flight 182 that killed 329 people. The Globe and Mail, Canada, March 16, 2005. New Delhi. More than 2 decades later, the Justice Nanavati Commission report has revealed that only 1 police official was convicted in the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in which more than 3,000 Sikhs were killed in Delhi alone. Interestingly, cases against 14 police officials could not be proceeded with as, quote, within the quotation, files were untraced. Besides these, in cases against 2 officers, no charge sheet was filed due to lack of evidence. 5 others were acquitted. Against 1, no evidence was reported. That's from the Tribune, India, August 9, 2005. So these excerpts juxtapose connected forms of, and this is me now, these excerpts juxtapose connected forms of anti-statist violence and botched jurisprudence, as well as forms of state violence and impunity in Canada and India. Apropos of historical grief, mourning, and melancholic grievance, which shape many victims' claims on the hyphen that at once bridges and divides nation and state, what interests me are certain designs of state violence and impunity. These designs are crucial to reconsider at a time when government and state, via processes associated with the term governmentalization, are increasingly read as interchangeable. Now, I proceed in this way by reclaiming instead of junking the state to go beyond a perfunctory reading of an essay called Force of Law by Derrida, which shows that justice as such, very much like forgiveness per se, is an impossibility that guarantees that law is alterable, that we can change law. For if we're content to halt at this insight into justice or forgiveness, which underlines the impossibility of resurrecting the murdered or of righting entirely historical wrongs, then we risk overlooking everyday implications of juridical claims that citizens make on the very states whose functionaries have brutalized them individually and collectively. Arguably, such appeals shoulder a burden of intimacy with the state, not as a static, but rather as a plastic and thus claimable concept. And I would be happy to talk about the problem of making the state far too concretized and as an object. There's a great deal of issues with that. As a plastic concept, thus claimable, the state is irreducible to the mantle of impunity that its functionaries are afforded. I see in this agonizing intimacy, shared with many victims of state violence worldwide, an escape from prevailing theories that reiterate the demise of the state in globalization. And these are legion, these theories. Such theories tend to exacerbate what Michael Dean and Casper Vladson call state phobia. As a locus of collective and psychic life, the state, however governmentalized, is neither dead nor disposable to citizens its functionaries have brutalized or vanquished. For those Eric Kasdan classifies as the already dead, the state, more so than the nation, persists as a kind of interiority. Alongside the murdered, the state as an abstraction is grieved and hence claimed in aftermaths of state violence. In Vectors of Grievance, grief of this magnitude channels Said's notion of the state as a state, as opposed to the state as a nation. This channel to Said is very important. For if we read the novel's postscript too quickly, we may find ourselves in a thicket of ethical universalism, which would fold easily into the novel's rather didactic image of Indira's net, and I quote from the novel. At each node of this net there hung a gem, so arranged that if you looked at one, you saw all the others reflected in it. As each gem reflected every other one, so was every human life being affected by the miseries and joys of every other human, unquote. From a certain precipice of civil society to which the state's co-optation by predatory global markets is further evidence of its demise as an instrument of justice, this passage on interconnectedness might compute with Badami's postscript to show how the governmentalized state acts unaccountably with violence and impunity on both sides of the world, eliciting disastrous chains of cause and effect. It certainly does act in this way, but not uniformly. For instance, how does the image of Indira's net fare with surplus populations, such as widow colonies that emerged after the pogroms of 1984? On its own terms, the net imagery is amenable to a rather liberal individualist reading that's only minimally descriptive of how globalization is experienced. That is, what occurs here might be felt economically or socio-politically elsewhere, and vice versa. However, any ethical universalism one might locate in the image stops short of universalizing ethics. It cannot account for ways in which destructive chains of cause and effect do not evenly matter the world over. And of course, Judith Butler addresses this issue of mattering with her question, when is life grievable? And this question has been reiterated several times throughout this conference. If we read the postscript through this question, what arises as very differently grievable at both ends of the spectrum, that is, in 84 and in 85, is a state that persists as claimable against the odds of governmentalization and beyond the limits of the term home, which serves as the novel's final word. The collapse of that final word in the experience of the already dead is precisely how the widow colonies of 1984 do and do not matter for ethical universalism. I hasten to add that the novel represents only a certain class of widows in the figure of Nirmaljit, whose devastating losses in partition predicate her devastating losses in 84. Nirmaljit's melancholic grief and post-traumatic stress, however, are largely circumscribed as private affects, and I quote from the novel here. Nirmaljit is described as, quote, a woman damaged in places too private to see, whereas for thousands of widows, the private-public binary, which banks so often on the propriety of one's home, rapidly crumbled. What strikes me here is that many of 1984's widows, who have only mattered to Congress officials, state police, and the general population as the already dead, continue to appeal to the state in ways that transcend pleas for recognition or accommodation. The government's clearing away of evidence from pogrom sites, the impunity held by what one widow calls government-supporting killers, despite 9 commissions of judicial inquiry, government dogs protecting themselves, the despair of living one's life through memories of the murdered, the torment of thinking an impossible justice, both in the absolute sense of murders that cannot be undone and in the institutional sense of perpetrators insulated by impunity. All of these harrowing dimensions of the widow's life world reinforce a concept of sovereignty that assumes, in Derrida's words, the shape of, quote, a circularity. Sovereignty is round. It is a rounding off, close quote. Hence, for the widow, the government dogs protect themselves through impunity's self-enclosing logic. Yet, we must listen carefully to the widow so as not to capitulate to an exceptionalist mode of sovereignty, should such a model not appeal to her sense of survival and memory. And I quote from one of the widows who has been interviewed. May God punish those who have done this to us, states one anonymized widow sorrowfully in an interview after decrying the circularity of sovereign impunity. I ask the government, why do we continue to suffer? We want justice, nothing else. This question points up a condition shared by thousands of survivors that I characterize as grieving a governmentalized state. Her claim on the state, after its totalizing executive power has been mobilized against her, her family, and her community, blends mourning with melancholia, grieving with grievance. It is a refracted claim, as opposed to an enraged or traumatized disavowal that persists despite waves of judicial alienation to which she and thousands of others have been subjected. In this jostling of affects, the widow's plea to God, Akal Purak, for justice, not only illustrates a political theological recourse to divine power against the cadaverous law of governmentalized states, it also constitutes a Lockean appeal to heaven against the brutality of sovereign impunity in its statist vector. As Bruce Rosenstock observes, Locke elaborates, quote, a notion of justice that allows the single individual, or in our context, an aggrieved group tormented by collective punishment, to appeal to heaven against the sovereign. Rather than the apocalyptic justice of last judgment, which characterizes a decisionist model of sovereignty always gripped by executive states of emergency, Locke's oppositional justice is modeled, in Rosenstock's terms, on a divine rectificatory justice, which restores justice when sovereign power acts with impunity. This will to justice from below, however, does not terminate with the indictment of murderous state functionaries for local atrocities. And there has been some success, especially with state police in Punjab, with indictments. But of course, it stops typically at the local level. It doesn't get up to the executive level. Rather, through the logic of grieving a governmentalized state, it intensifies itself by agitating for a radicalization of the state as a form of redress accountable to citizens devastated by state violence. In a regime of mass impunity, this collective will advocates for nothing less than a judicially other state, far beyond the reductions of governmental nationalism. The impracticality of this transformation has led to what I call a transnational division of juridical labor. Now, this division of labor concerns how the Sikh diaspora traffics judicially in, and thus lays claim to, the suffering of 1984's survivors and the memory of the murdered. Such claims take the form of legal advocacy groups based in the US, chief among them Ensaf and Sikhs for Justice, which have pursued lawsuits in Indian and US courts to end impunity for state functionaries, amid all the attendant problems of such representation. With successes and failures, such legal activism is counterintuitively significant for Sikh studies. Indeed, to date, this transnational division of juridical labor is a widely unexamined mode of Sikh cultural production, I'm arguing, through which historical grievances and grieving, mourning and melancholia pose a substantive challenge both to state-specific and international law. A challenge, and this is my last paragraph, a challenge of this order harbors a form of sovereignty against impunity, a divisible or weakening sovereignty, which in Arvind Palmander's view reflects the emergence of the Sikh Khalsa itself. For Sikh studies, such challenges might shift our focus from what Brian Axel very influentially calls the nation's tortured body to what I would call the state's tortured concept. The fact that it's just always in demise, according to popular theories of globalization. If we turn from the nation form, which includes the dispensations of Hindutva, Khalistan, and settler colonial Canada, to what Said calls the state as a state, we begin to trace historical grievances that hinge on a politics of grieving, and thus of reclaiming, not trashing, governmentalized states. Thank you.
So in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Jessica. Jessica Young is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she works in the fields of post-colonial studies and world literature with an emphasis in memory and trauma studies. Her dissertation examines the representation of memory sites in contemporary South Asian literature, focusing specifically on the transmission of transcultural counter-memories before and after September 11th. She is the co-founder of the Future of Trauma and Memory Studies Reading Group at the University of Illinois and co-editor with Michael Rothberg of Days and Memory, the blog of the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. Since 2010, Jessica has been a University of Illinois Graduate College Distinguished Fellow.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. I feel so honored to be able to enter into the conversation today with so many great academics whose work I've been reading and victims, family members. As being part of this conversation, I wanted to sort of say that part of my talk today is iterated earlier during a break with Renée Sarojini Saklikar. We were talking about sorry, and sorry not being enough sometimes because it relegates to the past that in which one is sorry for, and sometimes makes this rupture between a grief that might continue on even after sorry is said. And I think my talk is also going to sort of concretize this idea of eviction that we heard earlier with Shireen Razak's talk. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there. As we all know, the particulars, we've been talking so much about Air India, and we know that despite the staggering loss of life, it struggled to gain traction within the Canadian national or international consciousness. Part of this oversight can be contributed to the transnational nature of the tragedy, its various national and international causes and effects, not to mention the deterritorialized nature of the crash itself, all of which led to the tragedy becoming unhoused and continually displaced. As many scholars have noted, labeling the tragedy a foreign affair or overseas event strategically obfuscates Canada's history of exclusionary immigration policies and failed multicultural politics, as well as India's own ongoing ethnic and religious tensions. Yet I argue that this spatial displacement continues even after Canada has formally claimed the event as Canada's 9/11. Examining the ways in which Air India continues to be displaced within Canada's rhetoric of reconciliation highlights not only the typical temporal displacement of coming to terms with the nation's complicity in the tragedy, the sorry, that's in the past, not thinking about how it affects the future, but also the spatial displacements that reflect the complex transnational dimensions of this particular disaster. Thinking of these displacements as both spatial and temporal, I argue, elucidates a progressive national narrative that not only absolves Canada of its past guilt, but also undergirds many of the state's ongoing international policies, the ways in which it interacts transnationally based upon notions of national reconciliation. This paper then looks at the evolving spatio-temporal displacements that have occurred throughout the historical framing of the Air India disaster, and how this particular transnational tragedy can enlighten the dynamics of reconciliation within and beyond the nation. Canada's formal recognition of the Air India tragedy was part of many reconciliation gestures by the Harper government starting in 2008, and must be read within the state's rush to reconcile its often difficult and violent past. As many critics have noted, however, these recent attempts at state reconciliation often impose a temporal displacement on past suffering, allocating it to the past rather than elucidating its lasting effects on the present and foreseeable future. As the editors of Reconciling Canada note, the concept of reconciliation has been deployed in official gestures as a term that imposes closure upon grievance. And Amber Dean further notes, such state-sanctioned acts of public mourning are heavily enmeshed in a nation-building project that states its legitimacy on locating racism and colonialism in Canada's past. They fail to acknowledge and indeed actively suppress the many ways that these pasts continue to affect the present. These strategic discourses of recognition and reconciliation promote a progressive narrative of a nation that shores up national mythologies of Canada's dedication to pluralism and reinforce Canada's international reputation as a peacemaking nation. That's quoted from the editors of Reconciling Canada, and it does so by firmly relegating violence and injustice to the past. This conforms to what Berber Bevernage has called the allochronism inherent in the reconciliation process that allocates
into another time, phenomena which takes place in the chronological present, and those victims who refuse to participate in the process of nation building and reconciliation over past grievances. So again, they are excluded from the nation based on their very real continued grief over past events. This temporal displacement restricts how historical injustices can be viewed in the present. Yet such critical notions of reconciliation have only examined state-sponsored violence and therefore have curtailed conceptions of reconciliation to the state. I want to expand on these notions to reflect on the transnational nature of the Air India tragedy, to examine the ways in which it has not only been temporally historicized in Canada's rhetoric of reconciliation placed in the past, but also how it's been spatially displaced over time in order to reinforce Canada's image of a forward-looking, peaceful nation. Such an examination is important because it highlights the international claims of the state and the way it continues to mobilize the Air India tragedy for its own foreign affairs. Such an examination of the spatio-temporal displacements of this transnational incident can help us expand our framework beyond the nation when thinking through notions of state reconciliation processes. It has long been noted that in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, both India and Canada distanced themselves from the tragedy and its victims, effectively unhousing the event, with devastating consequences for the relatives of the victims, as we've heard. Almost immediately, Bharati Mukherjee and Clark Blaze found that the Air India disaster was in the process of disappearing from the larger Canadian consciousness. Politically, the tragedy was unhoused in that Canada wished to see it as an Indian event sadly visited on these shores, and India was happy to treat it as an overseas incident. In 1985, both states had political and cultural stakes in insulating themselves from the disaster. As India doesn't want its communal violence, the Sikh-Hindu conflict to gain the international spotlight, and Canada wished to gloss over its own institutional failings and its immigration and racial policies reaching back over 80 years. Mukherjee and Blaze described the tragedy as politically unhoused in that neither state wished to take ownership and thus responsibility for the attacks and their causes, rendering the event effectively deterritorialized, a displacement that the victims' relatives have consistently fought against. The struggle for state recognition is reflected in the literature at the time, including Mukherjee's own management of grief, where victims' families are pitted against state officials. The story depicts a Flight 182 widow who is asked to help a social worker navigate the complications of culture, language, and customs in an effort to provide state services to other mourning Indo-Canadian families. Simultaneous with this rush to fill out legal documents and distribute money to the families, however, is the paradoxical struggle to gain recognition of the tragedy. As the narrator notes, "I write letters to the editors of local papers and to members of parliament. Now at least they admit it was a bomb. One MP answers back, 'You want to make a difference? Politicize the Indian voter.' Not only does the state not initially recognize the tragedy as an attack on its own people, but the victims are also framed as removed from the workings of the political state, still Indian. However, the story also reiterates Canada's rhetoric of unhousing the attack when the narrator identifies herself as and the victims as "we who stayed out of politics and came halfway around the world to avoid religious and political feuding have become the first in the New World to die from it." This aside seems to place the blame for the attacks on foreign strife that followed these victims to the peaceful West, in line with Canada's political framing of the tragedy as a foreign affair, and in its use of the New World, seemingly presages the temporal historicizing of tragedies during the reconciliation process. Moments like these also seem to exonerate Canada of its history of exclusionary politics and settler colonial violence, even as the story speaks to the ongoing mismanagement of the tragedy and its aftermath by state agencies that do not have the right human touch. After years of advocacy on the parts of victims' families, and we've heard a lot about that advocacy, the Canadian government finally took measures to recognize the tragedy, including conducting an inquiry in 2006 to 2007, opening multiple Air India memorials, including one in Toronto in 2007, and proffering an official apology from Prime Minister Harper in 2010. As many critics have noted, however, these attempts to locate the tragedy within the aegis of the state have been strategically deployed as a means to justify Canada's increased security measures. In line with these criticisms, I see attempts at reconciliation, such as Harper's apology, as a re-territorialization of a transnational tragedy, a national claiming of it, that reaffirms a narrative of national cohesion and progressive futurity at the expense of a careful examination of the lasting vestiges of this very difficult past, and concludes with further spatio-temporal displacements of certain unincorporable subjects. While Harper concedes that this tragedy was conceived in Canada, executed in Canada by Canadian citizens, he follows this admission with an ominous plan to carefully and systematically marginalize those extremists who seek to import the battles of India's past here and then export them back to that great and forward-looking nation. As Casselbeus notes, Harper's apology achieves a careful political operation of both claiming the bombing of Air India Flight 182 as a Canadian tragedy, while simultaneously destabilizing the Canadianness of its perpetrators through the focus on external political motivation, reducing these subjects and their actions to imported and exported extremism from India's past, where these figures are made to appear as perverse free radicals wandering between but disenfranchised from the forward-looking India and Canada of the here and now. In this way, the causes of the tragedy are spatially and temporally relegated to someplace else, sometime else, so as not to interfere with the progressive futurity of both nations, a point I will return to later in this talk. So this rhetoric of spatial and temporal displacing is also present in Canada's much belated memorials to the victims, especially Toronto's memorial, that was unveiled during the 22nd anniversary. So beyond the sundial that's seen here and the memorial lies a small plaza with a bench emblazoned with the word. Yes, that's it. Yes, with the word reconciliation, emphasizing the central importance of the concept of reconciliation in the creation of these memorials. We are left to wonder, as Angela Failer rhetorically asks, exactly who or what is to be reconciled on this lakeshore, especially given the hastily constructed nature of this memorial, so it could be ready in time to coincide with the establishment of Canada's National Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terrorism. Reading the notion of reconciliation against what Failer argues is the strategic remembrance enacted by the Toronto Memorial, we can see it performs a defensive, this is a quote from Failer, a defensive reaction formation against the charge that systemic racism played a role in the state's belated, failed response to the fatal disaster. This concept of belatedness, I want to argue, is inscribed in the very form of the memorial and is itself a continuation of the tragedy's temporal displacement in the national imaginary. The Toronto Memorial replicated elements from the first Air India Memorial in Ireland, including the sundial. Oh, it's still not working. Thank you. So you can see the two sundials here. Yet the notion of time marked by this feature takes a different turn here in Ireland. In Ireland, the sundial continuously marks the exact time of the tragedy and points towards the plane's final resting place, keeping the event contemporaneous with the present. The repetition of the sundial in Toronto, however, relies upon the memorial in Ireland for its legibility, which only reaffirms the belatedness of the Toronto Memorial. Spatially, the immediacy of the Irish memorial and its proximity to the crash is replaced here with an emphasis on the transnationality of the disaster, where the sundial stones, the multicolored stones in the Toronto sundial, represent the affected Canadian provinces, India, England, Ireland, and Japan, and the sun's dial was inspired by the Indian flag to commemorate the origin of the plane. While it is essential to acknowledge the tragedy's transnational dimensions, I think that in this, what Angela Failer calls the busyness of the site, Canada's implication and its sort of history and of non-recognition is lost. And I just sort of want to take a moment to sort of say in its transnationality, it might be enacting another form of displacement. And this sort of comes into the fore as Canada prepared for the 30th anniversary of the attacks, and the memorial provided a setting for the state to advance its own foreign trade policy with India at expense of acknowledging continued acts of transnational violence. So this trade pact was made possible by the types of displacement the memorial affords. On April 16, 2015, the Canadian and Indian Prime Ministers visited the Toronto Memorial to lay a wreath in remembrance for the victims, but this visit was secondary to trade negotiations between the two leaders. This is a quote from the the Canada Star newspaper. The stop at the memorial followed a roundtable at which Modi and Harper sat down with business leaders. Modi extolled India's virtues as a great trade partner for Canada. For his part, Harper said Canada's trade relationship with India was an important one to have. This affirmation of trade between the two nations is literally sealed over the memorial to Flight 182's victims, victims whom both governments refused to acknowledge in the immediate wakes of the bombing. And as this paper makes clear, it comes at the expense of protests over Modi's alleged involvement in interethnic violence at home. This recent rush to commemorate the victims of Flight 182 then solidifies both states' economic agendas at expense of a sustained dialogue about the types of state violence that contributed to the Air India disaster, again promoting a strategic notion of recognition and reconciliation that foregrounds a progressive national narrative in lieu of a genuine appraisal of the difficult past and its iterations in the present. And I just want to sort of point to, this happened at the end of Harper's term as Prime Minister. We sort of don't know what the future of Air India is under Justin Trudeau, but after his recent comments that Canada can interact on the world stage without some of the baggage that so many other Western countries have, either colonial past or perceptions of American imperialism, there's a further erasure of Canada's long history of exclusionary immigration policies and complicity in colonial structures of violence. I want to conclude by examining a couple sites of productive transnational and transtemporal connection that highlights the possibilities in continuing commemoration of Air India's victims beyond the state's rhetoric of reconciliation. I think we've heard a lot about the activism, the ongoing activism of victims' family members. I think that is definitely a really important part of this process. I also want to highlight literature, and specifically, as we've sort of talked about it already at earlier panels and in this earlier paper, Anita Rao Badami's novel Can You Hear the Nightbird Call, which elucidates the transtemporal and transnational implications of the 1985 Air India disaster, linking as it does Canada's routing of the Kamagatu Maro in 1914 and the state's prolonged exclusion of Sikhs and other South Asian immigrants, and the partition of 1947 and other interethnic violence in India in the 1980s and 90s. As I indicated earlier, another productive site of the spatio-temporal commemoration is Ireland, where from the outset the local population was acutely sensitive to the family's grief. As one official noted, though the citizenship might have been confused, it didn't matter to the Irish in terms of the way they treated people. Everyone was treated with the greatest of humanity. In this third space, questions of state citizenship are superseded by other forms of effective belonging. And as many families noted, this humane treatment would have been absent had the plane crashed anywhere else in London or Toronto or Delhi. This post-traumatic contact created a lasting transcultural connection between these communities, as evidenced by the first memorial in Cork. To this day, the memorial is maintained by local residents who every year gather with the victims' families to commemorate the tragedy, and now, 30 years later, continue to grieve with the families over a sense of shared and ongoing loss. We've heard in previous panels and from victims' families that this might also be attributed to the Irish's own history of colonialism and violence that sort of, I think, links these two communities together even more. And I just sort of want to say that even with these sort of moments of connection and where shared grief can be sort of spent, Mukherjee and Blaze end the sorrow and the terror with the following plea: tell the world how 329 innocent lives were lost and how the rest of us are slowly dying. This demonstrates to me that the family's grief will always be present and will always try to work within and sometimes resist the state's attempts to spatially and temporally displace it. And I think it hints to the fact that some of these memorials are just not enough, that we still need to continue to figure out ways to grieve beyond the state's rhetoric of reconciliation. So thank you so much.